and welcome to the first video on the range of the function. So in the previous two videos we learned about the domain of a function. Now we want to look at something that is very closely related to the domain of a function, and it's known as the range. The range of a function. Now let's start off with a simple example. Y is equal to 2x minus 1. So f of x is equal to 2x minus 1. Like I said before, the domain of this function is what are the possible values of x that you can plug into this function. What are the possible values of x that you can plug into this function? Now, the thing you must understand about functions is when I plug in a value of x, I get a value of y. For example, if I plug in the value 0 here of x, the y value that I'm going to get is negative 1, because 2 times 0 is 0, 0 minus 1 is negative 1, so y would be equal to negative 1. So whenever I plug in a value of x, my output is going to be a value of y. So my input is x and my output is y. Now, the range of this function is what are the possible values that y can be. The domain of this function was what are the possible values that x can be. Now, the range of this function therefore is what are the possible values of y that can happen. And these values of y, they are dependent on these values of x, because these values of x are the ones that are deciding the values of y. So the domain of this function is going to decide the range of this function. The domain of this function is going to decide the range of this function. If I increase the domain of this function, I'm also going to increase the range of this function, because the range of a function depends on the domain of that function. So what are the values of x that I can put into this function, that's my domain, and what are the possible values that I can get out from this function, that is the range. Now, when you look at the range of this function, it's often useful to look at the function graphically. So this is a website called desmos.com. So this is desmos.com. You can come onto this website, you can sketch any graph that you want. You simply type it in here and it will sketch it for you, give you the coordinates of that graph and whatnot. It's a really useful website for graphing, and it's a website that I'm going to be using in future videos when I'm illustrating graphs. So this is the function y is equal to 2x minus 1, which I have here. Now, I want you to see how the domain of a function will affect the range of this function. So, when you sketch a graph, your y values are simply these coordinates here, the coordinates on the y-axis, and then your x values are these coordinates here, the coordinates on the x-axis. So, a simple way to think about this, therefore, is let me restrict my domain, and let me say the domain is x should be greater than or equal to 5. Let me say x should be greater than or equal to 5. So this is my restricted domain. So what this means is I'm not going to be allowed to plug in any x value that is going to be less than 5. And remember, like I said, graphically what this means is these x's here are the numbers on the horizontal axis, the x-axis, and the y values are the numbers on the vertical axis. Let me scale that in a bit. So, literally speaking, if my domain is x is greater than or equal to 5, it means that my graph has to start here. My graph has to start over here. My graph has to start over here. What it means is the graph on this side is going to be ignored, because I'm ignoring every single number that's to the left. So I'm ignoring any part of the graph, any chunk of the graph that has to do with these numbers less than 5. So if my x is going to start at 5, what it means is my y is going to start at 9. My y is going to start at 9. because when my x is 5, my y is going to be 9. When x is 5, my y is going to be 9. So any y value of the graph that's lower than 9, it's going to be ignored, because any y value that's lower than 9 is going to correspond to x coordinates that are less than 5. But my domain says my x coordinates should start at 5. So if my x coordinates start at 5, my y coordinates will start at 9. So this graph is going to start over here. So what it means is if it starts over here, it's going to continue extending until infinity. It can be anything just as long as it doesn't go below 9. So what that means is the range, okay, the range of this function, is therefore y is greater than or equal to 9, or f of x is greater than or equal to 9. F of x is greater than or equal to 9. That is going to be the range of my function here. And I have done this by looking at the graph. Now let's say I change my domain and then I say x should be less than 0. X should be less than 0. My question then is, what is going to be the range of this graph? What is going to be the range of this function? This function here, y is equal to 2x minus 1. Well, let me go to my graph. When x is 0, what is my y? My y is negative 1. My y is negative 1. So if x is less than 0, I'm only looking at the graph if I go on this side of the x-axis, which means now this inequality symbol is x is less than 0. It's not x is less than or equal to 0. So what that means is even the 0 itself is excluded. So if I'm only going to be going to this side of the 0, it means I'm only looking at this part of the graph, because when I go to this side of the 0, I'm going to this way on the graph. So if I start at 0, my y would be negative 1. But if I start going to this side of the 0, my y would be less than negative 1. Because if I go down on the graph like this, I'm going to y coordinates that are less than negative 1. So my range would therefore be y is less than negative 1, or f of x is less than negative 1. That would be my range for this function. Because if x is less than 0, at 0, my y would be negative 1. But as I go to this side of the 0, because it should be less than 0, then I'm going this way on the graph, and this way on the graph would be less than this negative 1. Negative 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on and so forth. So this would be my range. These would be the possible y coordinates that I can have on this graph. These could be the possible y values that I could have on this graph. If my domain was x is less than or equal to 0, then I would simply put the or equal to sign there. So this is the first video on how we can identify the range of a function. We will be looking at more examples in next videos. Until next time.